Great. Well, thanks very much, Paul, and thanks to Glenn and Brian and NRCan for the opportunity to meet and talk about what, obviously to me is a very important topic. And it's also very important for me to make some linkages to the insurance industry as well. We had a lot of interaction with the insurance folks in 2003. They did some very positive things that we really appreciated, and I look forward to that relationship being built on and continued in the future. So just while I'm loading this, a couple of pieces of news that I'm sure make everyone here happy. First of all, it snowed in Victoria on Sunday, and I know anytime it snows in Victoria, the rest of Canada cheers. And the Canucks lost last night, although I did hear that it was kind of a bad night for Canadian teams overall. I won't go any farther. So as Paul said, I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of things that have happened. As you've heard, I was involved in 2003, being the subject to a very significant review by Gary Filman, and looking at a lot of the factors that went into the fire season in British Columbia. Of course, everybody talks about Kelowna. I do like to remind people there was another community involved, Barrier, that was also severely impacted. And since that time, and since I've retired, I've also been involved in the other side of a review in helping with looking at what happened in Slave Lake. So I'll share what I can in terms of both of those events and a little bit of a contrast to what happened, but I'd like to also give you a bit of context. A lot of my background was doing a lot of the analytical work for programs and looking at budgets and trying to deal with that and trying to scale the level of preparedness that you've heard about. And so I'll talk a little bit about that and try and put it in a context that's meaningful to people in the insurance industry as well. In the fire business, as in all businesses, we tend to get wrapped up in the way we see the world, and hopefully I can translate that into some common thoughts on how we might look at this problem. And then, of course, I'll close with some lessons learned. I'll leave some of my thoughts in terms of what to do in the future for the group discussion this afternoon, but I'll obviously allude to some of that as I go through the presentation. So if I characterize the 2003 firestorm, as it was called, in British Columbia in one slide, these are some of the characteristics that come to mind. We started off with an extremely dry overwinter condition, and entering into the season, a lot of staff out in the field were warning me that it was going to be really tough. And as with all government programs, we were being subject to some reductions and had to make some hard choices and managed to maintain our level of preparedness through some sleight of hand on the budget side, hoping, of course, that an overwinter drought would be nullified by some rain in the summer, which unfortunately didn't materialize. And we ended up with a record drought in British Columbia, approximately 3 months long, which is pretty phenomenal. If you think about having to have that happen during a fire season is really tough. We had a somewhat above average fire season in terms of number of fires, but the number of fires doesn't always tell you what's going to happen. We've had up to 4,000 fires in a fire season. We ended up with 2,500 in 2003. We had 22 communities threatened, and it's always very challenging when you have a large number of communities threatened. You have to distribute your resources to try to deal with all of those threatening fires. And so much as everybody heard about Kelowna and now, of course, Barrier that you heard about, many of the other communities that were threatened, you didn't hear much about them. In the end of the day, we lost 334 homes and businesses. It was a phenomenal thing to happen in Canada. This had not occurred for a long time. And so it really caught the country by surprise that such a thing could happen. The insured losses, as Mike mentioned, were at least 200 million. And my sense is it's quite a bit more than that. I'm aware of some pretty substantial losses in terms of mills, et cetera. And hopefully, at some point we'll have a pretty good understanding of what that might be. So just to put it into context, when you look at the summer rainfall that I mentioned, a couple locations, it was actually the lowest amount of summer rainfall they'd ever had on record. And we're talking records going back over 100 years. Even Vancouver had a rainfall amount that was the lowest they'd seen in over 50 years. We talk, and I'll try and avoid too much fire jargon, but we have what we call a drought code, which is similar to an agricultural drought index that tells us roughly how much moisture deficit there is. And in our case, it's mostly for the deeper organic fuels and large fuels. And so for most agencies in Canada, 500 is a pretty serious drought code. That's getting into extreme. And so we had drought codes well beyond that across the province. And as well, we look at things, how dry all of the fuels are, and we have what we call a buildup index. I was never sure where the name came from, but what it really describes is the amount of fuels that are available, not just the big drought-type fuels, but also all the fine fuels. And I just show this slide because it provides a good context for all the other serious fire seasons we'd had in British Columbia. And for this particular station, it didn't start off with any particular extreme dryness, but as soon as we started to get into later in June, it started to become apparent that we were going to get levels that were pretty serious. And you can tell every time it rains during even a bad fire season like 1985, that all of a sudden the buildup index will drop because some moisture gets back into the fuels. But you can tell at this particular weather station, zero rain right till it goes off the scale at the end of August. And in fact, it wasn't until about the 12th of September that this particular station got some rain. So the extent of the drought covered a very substantial part of the province. We say the bottom third was into what the rest of Canada would consider extreme, and then the extreme down in a core part of the Okanagan and over into the Kootenays. And if you remember this pattern of the 750 plus, the red area, when you look at where the very problematic fires occurred, and these were all fires that threatened communities, were all spread throughout that extreme area. And so you look at some of the things we dealt with during that season. Right in the height of the worst of it, we were still getting lightning fires occurring, other types of fires, and we would get up to 218 fires, new fires a day. And during one 6-day period, we ended up with 763 new fires. And so back to the comment around, what's the strategy for dealing with this situation? When we've got 1,000 firefighters in our organization and we're having to deal with this number of new fires coming online, we absolutely have to hit every one of these new fires as hard as we can to prevent them from becoming a large and very costly fire in terms of commitment of resources. 220 rotary wing helicopters. That's more aircraft than the Canadian forces have. So we have a small organization of 200 people having to manage that type of force. 7,600 firefighters. That year, every province and territory in Canada contributed firefighters. We also had the Canadian military helping us out in a large way. It was the largest assembly of firefighters ever in the history of Canada, and maybe going forward, we may never see that type of rallying of firefighters, just because there may not be the availability of military and other resources. So at one point we had almost 750 fires active at one time. So again, do the math here. That leaves you 10 people per fire. And when you have fires like Kelowna where you've got several thousand involved, it doesn't leave you a lot of people to put on each of the individual fires. The expenditures maxed out at $9 million a day. I remember talking to the Premier on a couple of occasions and sort of querying him how comfortable he was with us spending that level of, making that level of expenditure. And basically his response was, you have to do what you have to do. So the significance, total number of interface fires, 37, 22 communities threatened. So again, you do the math, that means there was 15 fires that threatened communities that were already had interface fires ongoing. Again, the homes and structures lost compared to our average, substantially more than we'd ever seen before. And suppression costs totaling $350 million. Add to that about $50 million in preparedness costs and $40 million in fire department costs as well. So getting pretty close to $500 million spent just by one province in 1 year. So let's compare this to the Slave Lake situation that everyone's aware of. Alberta actually started off on almost the other end of the extremes. A wet overwinter conditions. In terms of number of fires, actually slightly below But what made the significant difference, and I'll talk in a little bit more detail about how the factors combined, and Mike alluded to it, an extreme wind event. And everybody hears about the winds on that particular day, but it was actually 5 days of sustained winds across a very large part of the province. And the significance of that is not the effect that it just has on any fire that starts, but the effect that it has on the fuels. So in other words, you've got grass that's dead. The snow is now being sublimated or melted off of the grass fuels and other small fuels on the surface. And the wind accelerates that process. And until the soil actually starts to warm up, you don't get the new grasses and the green up conditions that are going to improve fire conditions for people. So those winds started to basically blow dry the fuels out there. And where fires did start, they grew very rapidly and started to threaten communities. And across Alberta, they ended up with 23 communities that were threatened, and some very substantially. There were structures lost in other communities as well. And so major efforts had to be made to protect those communities. Everyone's aware of the damage to Slave Lake. Poplar Estates just outside of Slave Lake was also impacted, and communities along the south shore of Slave Lake were also impacted by a different fire. Overall, approximately 400 homes and businesses were destroyed, and important to everyone here is the insured losses were estimated around $700 million. So some of the differences. Well, you saw the Buildup Index for British Columbia climbing over 300. Well, the Buildup Index wasn't actually that high on the days up to and including the days that the fires grew around Slave Lake. The drought code wasn't extraordinary either because of the wet overwinter conditions. But what really made a difference on that fire was a couple of factors that you can see in the weather here. The sustained winds, you can see in the solid green line, 50 kilometers an hour, extremely hard to deal with winds. If you've got a fire being pushed by 50 kilometer an hour winds, you've got a problem. And these are winds at the surface. You know, there was much higher winds happening above. The gusts in these winds measured at the airport at 89 kilometers an hour. We heard of winds over 100 kilometers an hour or gusts being measured at weather stations around Slave Lake. What's also important is you'll see the temperature in red, and it doesn't get to extreme values, but at around 20, when you start to get humidities dropping to 20, and this is a concept they use in Alberta called crossover, once those two start to get close to each other or cross over, you end up with conditions where fuels dry very quickly and become very flammable. And so a combination of these factors were definitely contributing to what the folks are dealing with on the ground. And you're going to hear after lunch about some of those challenges that people dealt with. So I'd just like to talk about an important principle, which is fire intensity. And this is actually one of the most useful pieces of information that is used by wildland firefighters. And in British Columbia, or in Alberta, it's called intensity class. British Columbia, we call it fire ranking. It's basically the same scale. And when a fire is just smoldering, it's called intensity class 1. It's actually measured in energy release rates per meter of fire line. And it's, you know, obviously pretty easy to deal with. Intensity class 2 and 3, you can deal with crews on the ground. Once you get into intensity class 4, you start to have to deal with the indirect attack or aerial attack to start to stop the fire. Intensity class 5, you're pretty lucky if you can start to knock a fire like that down from the air. Mark Missel can fill you in on just how much of a challenge that can be. Once you get to intensity class 6, we're talking energy release rates that people probably just don't really fathom. And I heard a good way of explaining it on a fire we had in 1998 in Salmon Arm. At that, with a medium to large size fire at intensity class 6, you're releasing the same energy as a nuclear warhead every 2 to 3 minutes. And so if you can put yourself in a position of trying to stop a fire with that much energy, you know, you can understand that you're dealing with nature at its worst. So when you translate that to what was going on around Slave Lake, you can see in the pink is intensity class 6, So this is a map of projected intensity class of how hot those fires would be if they started, right? And this is used as a planning tool for the Alberta Forest Service. And coming back to the question on attacking these fires, this intensity class determination tells the organization how many resources they should be throwing at individual fires. And obviously, as the intensity class goes up, you try to throw more and more resources at fires more quickly to try to get them while they're small before they gain the momentum and start to release that type of energy. So maybe just to, step back. Just to recall, Slave Lake is right here. The South Shore communities were along in here where homes were lost. But there was also fire up in here and a number of other fires around the province that were threatening communities at the same time that Slave Lake was being threatened. So significant challenge for the organization. And in fact, I'll talk a little bit about this later, the significance of all that activity. But in terms of what we've heard, this was the second largest insured loss in Canadian history, right after the ice storms. 700 families were affected. We've heard about 400 homes and buildings being lost, while a number of apartments were lost and ended up displacing a very large part of the population. There's also a significant loss of town infrastructure, and a key part of that, with losing the community or town offices, they lost a lot of the records that they maintained for operating the community. Some of you may have also heard that this fire season, because of impacts on the oil and gas industry, actually had a measurable impact on the national GDP through loss of some of the oil and gas activity, as well as impacts on other industrial output in the province. So just quickly to go through some of the similarities. These are things that I've observed in looking what happened in both situations. In 2003, our headspace was altered by some of the things that were happening around the world. We knew that there was major fires in Australia and Europe, fatalities in Portugal, if folks remember, major fires in California as well. 2003 was a tough year worldwide for fires. And likewise, if you recall, early in 2011, we saw a lot of the fires in Texas and the south central US that burned well after when they were expected and started up again early again in 2011. And I would say that the agencies were well prepared for what agencies normally prepare for. That this wasn't something that the organizations had no idea could happen. That preparations were made, that organizations did what they could to deal with it. But what was key was that there was widespread threat to many communities, and Alberta was fighting fires on many fronts. And it was actually later in the events, in other words, as fires started to threaten a number of communities, resources had to be committed to those fires, that new fires that were equally as threatening occurred. And in the case of both Kelowna and Slave Lake, even though you gave these fires the highest priority in the province, you still could not extricate yourself from dealing with other fires threatening communities. Equally important is these were events that required a very high level of cooperation with the local fire services, to the extent that, as Jamie will talk later, that these are situations that most fire services in those provinces had not experienced before. So very significant events from that perspective. And as well, we'll be hearing a lot about FireSmart and FireWise. These are situations where those programs were underway, but because they take many years to implement FireSmart for any community, they were at the initial stages of implementing FireSmart in both situations. So some of the key differences. As mentioned, differences in the overwinter conditions, and also differences in the drying period. In the case of Slave Lake, it was about 4 days of intense drying with high winds. that resulted in those field conditions. In British Columbia, we had drying conditions over 3 months long from the time of the last rainfall. The winds, significant difference, major winds in terms of Slave Lake. Whereas in British Columbia, we had diurnal winds. The winds would drop down during the day. You'd make major efforts to try to gain on the fires. Winds would come up, in the case of Barrier, winds would come up in the afternoon, blew the fire into town. In the case of Kelowna, there were overnight winds that made spectacular fire advances in the evening and nighttime into the populated areas. Fire danger, as shown, the fire danger for all across the board in British Columbia, everything was off the scale in terms of fire conditions. In the flat top or the Slave Lake situation, we had fairly low drought codes and BOIs, but because of the winds, the head fire was extreme as well. And the key lesson here is that you can't always predict well in advance as to when these type of events are going to occur. And as Mike said, you know, if we're looking for more major wind events, we may see more situations like Slave Lake going forward. The extreme fire growth, we were actually fighting the fire that went into Kelowna for 5 days. It started on the 18th of August and entered the community on the 22nd. Whereas the fire that affected Slave Lake started around 5 o'clock in the afternoon on Saturday, and by 8 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday, it had caused major damage in the town. Large areas burned in both situations. For British Columbia, 270,000 hectares is a huge area to have burned. Likewise for Alberta, they tend to have slightly larger areas burned per year, but almost 1 million hectares. Structures lost, as mentioned, but what's also forgotten in a lot of cases is that there were lives lost in both situations. In British Columbia's situation, we lost 3 pilots that season, and there was a pilot who perished on the Slave Lake fire several days after the main event. And I would say in both these cases that they weren't directly a result of the extreme fire behavior, but it just does demonstrate to folks that this is a endeavor that does carry risk, and the people we have involved are putting their lives on the line fighting these fires. Mike talked a little bit about the ENSO, and I'll have a slide to talk a little bit about El Niño and La Niña. But one thing I thought I would put forward, and feel free to correct me on this, but from information I have, we had extremely high rates of insurance in Kelowna, 98% plus, but much lower in Barrier. And the impacts on those two communities the different impacts is so stark. It's, to me, a real reminder of how important insurance is. And it's why I see this as an important discussion today, to talk about insurance for people that are in these situations. From what I've heard, and I don't have complete information yet, but that there was a reasonable level of insurance rates in Slave Lake, which has helped very much in terms of their recovery. So I did say I'd talk just briefly about El Niño, and this is something, as I was putting the presentation together, I thought I'd look at whether there's any information on El Niño and La Niña that might be of help. So if you look at this graph on what's called the El Niño Southern Oscillation, if it's below 0 or blue, it's La Niña. If it's above 0 or red, it's El Niño conditions. And so you can see for 2011, fairly strong La Niña. For our situation, fairly strong El Niño. 2001, Alberta, again La Niña. Starting to see a pattern here. 1998 was a very strong El Niño. Interestingly though, Alberta also had some fire problems in 98. So the pattern holds till you get back to about 1985. And then we start to see that it doesn't always hold true. But there does appear to be some relationship, and perhaps, you know, at lunchtime we can grill Mike on whether or not there really is a relationship or not. But I do want to talk about one other important context piece, and that's Mike mentioned the level of preparedness. And as mentioned, one of my roles in British Columbia in my early career was dealing with some of the budget challenges. And I've always struggled with why is it can't we convince provincial governments to fund their wildfire agencies to deal with what is really the big picture impacts of fire. And so if we talk about some of the issues around the economics, I'd just like to go through some of the things that I used to try to bring forward and maybe help you understand some of the challenges that we deal with. And obviously one of the important aspects is the production function, that if you prepare more and have more firefighters, more resources, you're going to contain the fires when they're smaller. It's going to cost less in terms of what you have to actually expend in terms of what we call direct fire in British Columbia. And if you look at just a very simple way of portraying where you might want to be on this preparedness curve, there's a minimum in terms of what a provincial government, for example, would have to expend in terms of preparing for and fighting the fires. And this is obvious. The easiest argument to make to government is, I can save you money if I spend a little bit more on preparedness, right? And that's generally as far as you can get with the argument. But there is a couple more levels to this. One key one is, what about the damages? And this is something that everybody can understand. So that as you start to eliminate damaging fires, or can stop them, as Mike said, when they're small, you're going to avoid some of these large impacts in terms of damages. And so again, if you add that together, you end up with a curve with a minimum. If you recall, if you're just minimizing costs, you're somewhere about there. But if you actually want to minimize the overall damages, you're probably going to be doing something more like this. Unfortunately, my experience is, working with provincial budgets, you tend to work more towards minimization of cost. And it's somewhat understandable in constrained budget periods. So you have a gap, and this gap actually would be even more if you consider the economic impacts, right? If you start to think about, what's the impact on provincial GDP, national GDP, et cetera. And there is a lot of that associated with wildfires as well. So what about the gap, and who fills it? Well, my argument would be that at the end of the day, the insurance industry ends up having to bear some of this, because we're talking about damages to insured assets out there. But we're also talking about communities, and communities ending up filling some of that gap, their firefighters. And as Mike alluded to, I think there is a role that communities can play, both in dealing with some of the prevention efforts in terms of Fire Smart, but also looking at how they can become much more involved and engaged in terms of sprinkler systems, et cetera. So I just want to take this concept one step farther, and I try to think of how can I relate this to your business. And so went back in the records, and I shouldn't even put a left axis on here, because this is just my crude estimates of number of homes lost over history and kind of what's happened. If you go back to the Miramichi fire in the early part of the 1800s, when people started to realize that just going around and leaving logging debris around communities was going to cause problems and kill people and burn communities down, substantial efforts started to be mounted in terms of developing prevention planning, legislation to deal with all that. But of course, because it was logging debris, et cetera, it all fell on the forestry organizations to deal with it. And I think that Canada did a really good job. We started to establish some research programs on how to deal with wildfires, to know when to have resources available to fight them. And just in a way of characterizing it, I put a graph in terms of prevention and preparedness, okay? And so it went along really well until we started to become very successful, and provinces started to think, well, okay, we've put the right amount of investment. Federally, I would say it's fair to say, believe we got to the point where we've done all the research necessary and started to shut down research facilities in the 80s and 90s. But we start to see that what's happening is we're starting to get back into losing homes. And so the big question is why? We've made that preparedness investment, Why are we now starting to lose the fight again? And so I'd like to kind of outline what I see are the suggested causes for this increase. Climate change, I think there's a fair argument to be made there, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But I think there are other issues as well. As Mike mentioned, expanded use of the wildlands. And so what that does is it puts a lot more resources and assets at risk out there. It causes a huge commitment of existing preparedness resources to fighting fires that threaten those assets. It also has caused an increase in the number of fires. And so we're seeing man-caused fires increasing in some jurisdictions. And so you remember, if we've plateaued the amount of resources available, but the workload is going up, you're bound to see more failures. The question was raised, what about if the success of fire suppression in terms of reducing fire's role in getting rid of some of the fuels? My case there is that in British Columbia, if you wanted to maintain the historical role of fire, you'd have to be disturbing about 500,000 hectares, 500,000 hectares a year of the forest. Forest harvesting is about 200,000. Wildfires are generally around 50,000. So right now, without a very significant prescribed burn program, you're not going to maintain that equilibrium. And so you will be accumulating fuels in the forest. And interestingly, in many cases, communities don't want you disturbing forests around their communities. They want those trees and those stands left alone. And it's one of the big challenges trying to implement a fire smart program in many places in Canada. As mentioned, I think that the plateauing of wildfire resources and technology is a problem, as well as cutbacks in research and development. So just to briefly touch on climate change, and I apologize to everybody with a science background in the room in advance for my next couple of slides, but I just wanted to find a way that maybe could bring together what Mike mentioned in terms of the Gillette study relating area burned and temperature to what we're seeing in terms of, quote, the hockey stick graph and the uncertain future of what may happen with climate change. And just to give people a little pause for thought of what might happen in the future. Are we talking, getting back to very significant losses in terms of communities and homes and assets and economic impacts of wildfires in the future? So just to come back and answer the question, are these recent wildfire events harbinger of what may come in the future as a result of climate change or other factors? Well, my view is that climate change is likely going to play a pretty big part going forward. And based on Paul's poll, I think folks in the room would agree that wildland fuel conditions are deteriorating, is the word I'll use, that we are seeing accumulations of fuel and we need to do something about it. That the increased development and use of the wildland is going to contribute to escalating fire problems in the future, and that the capping of investment in terms of fire preparedness and fire prevention is going to have an effect, and that if we don't find a way to reverse a reduction in research and development, we're not going to move forward as quickly and as well as we should. So my personal lessons learned are that there isn't a wildfire agency in Canada that can deal with the worst case that can come at them now. And if the worst case is getting worse, they need to think about what they're going to do in the future. That communities and fire departments have to be part of the solution, because unfortunately they're going to be seen as the biggest impact in the future if we don't find a way to respond. And the point about wildfire on the landscape, a number of provinces have come up with wildland fire strategies, and I think that we're going to see a need for more of that. That wildfire is going to become a bigger player on the landscape, and it's better that it be done in a managed format than it happen the way it might without some form of management. We need research and development to chart our path forward. We need to know where and what types of investments to make in Fire Smart to make in improving our fire suppression capability to improve on fire prevention. And that I don't think there's any doubt that climate change will be a major force in future seasons. But if there are any climate change deniers out there, Rick Santorum or otherwise, even without climate change, we still need to be concerned about the future and start to think about what we need to do to protect our communities and homeowners. So with that, thank you.
Block of time here for questions.
Peter, excellent talk. My name is Paul Gray. And perhaps this is an unfair question, but I'm just wondering if in your travels and your experiences with the various events, whether or not you have a sense of whether there's a psychological trauma associated with this, a psychology of dealing with extreme events, and whether or not that needs to be factored into some of the solutions that we might want to go forward in terms of developing adaptive management strategies.
Yeah, that's a really good comment. I mean, what we see in all fire organizations is right after a large event like this, like 2003 or 2011, you've got the attention of people to try to do something. And just as an example, in British Columbia, 6 months after the Kelowna fire, we had communities that had put it all behind them, and they weren't interested in talking about it. And if you think about constrained budgets that provinces have, that municipalities have, it is really tough to keep this on the radar. And I know in BC we have what we call an all hazards approach to dealing with emergencies, and there's 57 of them. And so, it's pretty hard to keep wildfire as a high priority with every community in BC. But our view has been make funding available, give them the options of how to deal with it, and communities will have to make choices in terms of what are their priorities in dealing with these type of emergencies. With provincial organizations, I think that again, they go through cycles. It depends on where they are financially, whether they can afford to invest more in it. But I do believe that we need to make the argument that this is a matter of protecting communities. It's a matter of reducing economic impacts of wildfires. And yes, there can be somewhat interspersed events. You don't see them that regularly, but we do need to share information, keep it on government's radar so that budgets for fire prevention and preparedness don't get cut.
Other questions?
Hold on. Are there zoning issues involved with this? For example, when you look at some of these smaller communities, sort of on this urban fringe, I've seen that sometimes zoning is not as strict as you might have, say, in a larger city. Therefore, you end up building in areas where perhaps you either A, shouldn't build, or B, there's not enough protection put in.
Mm-hmm. Another good question. FireSmart does help to deal with that, but there's also work underway with the Planners Association in Canada, and they have, a number of communities have started to take that on in terms of both planning, zonation, and requirements for developers. But it's just in its infancy, but it's a really important thing to try to get into councils, to their planners, to consider that as they move forward. And to me, it's an area where perhaps the insurance industry could help. If there's some linkages between good planning and say community ratings, et cetera.
Question in the back?
Where are you?
Peter, you mentioned the high winds the day of the Slave Lake fire. Can you comment on the impact it had on the use of fixed-wing aircraft to fight the fire?
Sure. Yeah, good question as well. That is, obviously a major factor when you have those type of winds, that it can affect a lot of different fire suppression efforts. And in that case, it was the winds reached the point where it was no longer safe to fly air tankers and attack that fire. It's questionable when you get that type of fire intensity the degree to which you can have an effect on the fire, and perhaps Mark can speak to that later, but it was something that's well known in that fire, that the winds reached a level where the air attack had to be called off for safety of the pilots. You know, we're talking major turbulence as well that was occurring in that area, and extremely difficult flying conditions. And it does point to the fact that we rely a lot on aircraft to fight fires, and there are circumstances where, you know, aircraft either aren't available or are unable to be effective in terms of firefighting as well.
Okay, I'm going to ask a question if I don't see another one. And then Kevin first. Go ahead.
Hi, it's Kevin Smart. I wonder if you have a rule of thumb. So if there's a major wildfire, what radius, for example, would you be concerned for communities in that area?
Okay, well, lots of good questions today. I don't personally believe in rules of thumb, although in some cases, you know, it does make sense if, you know, there's a fire within 10 kilometers or so of a community that you should be concerned. It's important to remember there's two impacts, excuse me, and Mike alluded to the other one as well. Well, obviously the fire is a major threat to structures and people, but the smoke itself can be a significant problem. And so we've had fires 30, 40 kilometers away, and I know in Ontario they've done the same, where you have to evacuate a community because of the smoke impact. So that's one consideration. We have fire behavior specialists that can tell you when a community is a threat, and Barrier was a good example for us. It was about 10 kilometers away from the community when one of the fire behavior specialists expressed to me that her thinking was that fire was going to be in the community by about 3 o'clock that afternoon. And we all thought, you know, surely we're going to be able to make enough effort to stop that fire. And she explained her projection, and she was within, I think, about 30 minutes. So fires can threaten communities from a fair ways away. I think the Fort McKay fire, and Adam or Mark, you may correct me here, but it made something like a 25-kilometer run in one afternoon. So fires can threaten from a fair distance away, and so I think strategically you want to come up with ways of projecting fire growth that is going to help, but also projecting the risk of if a fire starts, you know, in this particular area, how much of a threat will it be?
Yeah, I'm going to do one last question, then we'll move on to the next speaker. There's quite a bit of sharing between provinces about best practices and what's effective and where challenges exist. When you're looking internationally, what other countries around the world do you find are helpful, or perhaps giving warning signs in terms of what might come to Canada?
Well, that's a perfect question from the perspective of how the fire community works, because it really has become a very much community of sharing across the world. You know, we're used to sharing, and you know, Kim will talk about the resource sharing within Canada and with other agencies in terms of firefighting resources. But in terms of different countries that have dealt with these issues, as mentioned, the Fire Smart program in Canada has a lot of strong parallels to FireWise in the US, and we share a lot of information across the border. We also have started to share a lot with Australia in terms of kind of the Fire Smart concepts and community protection. They've been in that business longer than I think anybody, and have had to deal with some very tough issues, because not only did they lose structures, there's been a lot of fatalities in Australia as well associated with fires. And so, you know, we've had a lot of really good exchanges with Australia and New Zealand as well in terms of knowledge and practices. But we're also starting to get into much more resource sharing, because you gain a lot better understanding of each other's business if you actually go down and help fight fires. And we've done that with Australia from British Columbia, sent firefighters down. And likewise, there's been firefighters come up from Australia and New Zealand to help in Canada. So it's becoming a worldwide community, and you know, there's a lot of really good work, and good point to how we need to continue to improve on sharing that.
Thank you. If everybody can